My name is David Eggins. I work as a volunteer for the charity Temper Domestic Violence. This is my response to the Panorama film screened on the 8th of October 2018. Firstly, I should like to thank and pay tribute to Sibby for his enormous bravery in agreeing to expose himself to some very uncomfortable scenes and experiences, and of course some enormous subsequent anxieties leading up to the broadcasting of the programme, all of which he has handled manfully. Our grateful thanks also to the many guys who allowed their work to be filmed in preparation, and the willing help and contributions which many offered, which simply didn't make it into the final cut. It's in very correctly seeking to produce a balanced programme for the digestion of the general public. There were, of course, very many issues which got left out, one or two minor mistakes, and perhaps some politically unmentionable things, or things which do not fit with the BBC narrative. The mistakes first. Support of victims. We try hard to attach victims to mainstream victim supporter groups, but we do offer a telephone support service to those people unable to access mainstream support, and we do this via accredited counsellors not linked to the organisation. Completion statistics. The Panorama programme wobbled a little between two abuser programmes, Phoenix in Wales and ours. Phoenix's completion statistics were quoted as 50%. That is excellent compared with other Duluth-style programmes, the accredited ones. For example, as many as a quarter of the men make it through, i.e. 75% of the men drop out of their programme or get kicked off. Our completion statistics were not quoted, but more than 90% of men that start our programme complete it, more than 100%, and more than 95% of very many fewer women. We have to remember that the overriding strategy of the government is the prevention of violence to women and girls. In the domestic violence arena, why this would exclude boys is something of a mystery or oversight. It could so easily have read children. You can imagine the scenario of fraternal twins, the girl to be protected and the boy not to be protected. And of course, maybe that would have meant that boys had to be acceptable in refuges, and how can you possibly accept government money for women and girls and yet be spending it on housing the girl's twin brother? I'll now talk briefly about some of the other issues. Almost inevitably they go into the realms of politics, finances, Duluth, completion statistics, social services, CAFCAS, the range of domestic abusers, the total absence of female domestic abusers. Finances first. Lou Moultrie, the woman with the tattooed arms of the Freedom Together programme, which looks to be the amalgamation of Croydon Women's Aid with Bromley Women's Aid, bemoaned the lack of finance for her organisation. That was her take. The blogger William Collins has very carefully gathered together information about the funding of Women's Aid and the refuge movement. You can check out the findings yourself, but from my old man's memory, the female victim supporting industry, according to his research, employed something like 7,700 women, enjoyed an income of 298 million per year, and from other sources, one charity could afford to pay one CEO in excess of £180,000 per year, plus pension contributions, and still complain that bed spaces are as scarce as gold dust. According to William Collins, about 11% of the income is actually spent on refuges. Collins also writes, averaged over the sector as a whole, the cost of refuge accommodation is £77,000 per woman year, noting that this includes an average of roughly one child per woman, and also incorporates the cost of other services, not just refuge accommodation. The size of this figure illustrates that the bulk of the funding to the DV sector is not expended on refuge accommodation, contrary to what the public might expect. Last year, our minnow organisation had income of, in round figures, £15,000 and completed work with 43 men and 1 woman. 2 men failed to complete the work. By the time our minuscule overheads are covered, supervision by a now retired consultant psychiatrist, room hire in which to deliver the work, insurance, telephone, travel, etc., there is not enough money to pay 1 person, let alone 2 people needed to facilitate the work. Our estimated cost of running a project for a year is about £65,000. That demonstrates just how far below the breadline we are. Our ambition will be to deliver a full programme of 10 courses per year in each of 5 major areas: London, Birmingham, Bristol, Manchester and Sheffield, Leeds, Wakefield. Another positive outcome is that we have recently written 29 reports. Of 29 reports written, 18 have been deemed successful thus far, 8 are pending and 3 have been not granted. 2 of those not granted involved social services taking children into care. 1 of the 18 successfully reported involved the father being awarded custody of a child as opposed to his child being taken into care. There have been many contacts granted with no report, just the production of a satisfactory completion certificate. Many of the men we work with are prevented from living with their families, which implies additional housing costs. Many will still be supporting their families in flats and houses, and in very many cases honouring their responsibilities and paying child support. Those in private law cases may well be paying solicitors between £200 and £260 per hour, measured in 6-minute gaps. Those that are granted supervised contact, typically in a contact centre, may well face having to pay £120 per meeting. Those in private law cases will find themselves easily paying £1,000 per hearing, and one of the men we have worked with has had 36 such hearings. I have heard of others whose bills are between £60,000 and £100,000. Of course, all of these costs in very many cases mean that there is very much less money available to the children of the family. And those are the wealthy guys. Then there is a whole raft of other guys with finance which gets nowhere near these kinds of amounts of money. They end up in the family court representing themselves, being litigants in person, or in some cases employing a so-called Mackenzie friend. I would be surprised if all of the organisations delivering work with domestic abusers had a total income of more than £10 million between them. Compare that with the £298 million received by the Refugees and Women's Aid affiliated organisations. Duluth is a model for working with domestic abusers. The Duluth Abuser Programme forms the basis of virtually all of the accredited work. It is not surprising that the employees of the accreditor, a charity called Respect, favour that programme, since they were employed by the DVIP prior to accrediting effectively their own programme, in which they will doubtless have vested interests. A former client of ours wrote extensively about them, and you can read this by logging into our website later on. The address is given. It was about the DVIP, that is. His description of his experiences with both the DVIP and social services match what we hear time and time again. On a BBC Radio Northampton programme, Neil Blacklock of DVIP Respect stated, "Sometimes as many as a quarter of the men make it through the programme. You can hear the obstacle course in the language of that." Before a select committee of the Home Office, the then CEO of DVIP quoted these costs to turn a man around, which you can read at in the transcript of the thing. 33 men completed the DVIP programme that year at an expenditure of £219,000. The CEO claimed a success rate of 70%. That would mean just 22 men of the 230 that contacted the organisation. An effective completion? Virtually £10,000 by his claim. The figure he quoted, based on referrals versus cost, essentially turned 198 men round and walked them straight back out of the door at just over £1,000 each. In private law cases, what are the costs to the abuser of these Duluth-style power and control programs to hold men accountable? 32 weekly sessions of about 2.5 hours each cost between £60 and £80 per session, £270 to £300 per month for 9 months, plus travel. The academic in the programme, Dr. Jean Fader, very rightly pointed out that ignoring perpetrators ignored the upstream problems. The problem is, he said, we do not have secure evidence that the programs are effective in bringing about changes. But if you just respond to survivors, you are in some ways just colluding with the cycle of violence. In 2011, clinical psychologist Dr. Louise Dixon took the accreditor, Respect, to task, drawing attention to the underlying feminist ideology and the lack of evidence base for the work they were insisting on. She called for the accreditation to be abandoned. Elsewhere, she also wrote that there was no criminological need for female abusers to have separate courses. In 2012, the Centre for Social Justice produced a paper calling for the current programmes to be scrapped and a fresh start to be made when something is not working. This was essentially what happened with the IDAP programme, accredited and run by the Probation Service. It was also a Duluth model. In 2014, the Ministry of Justice, no less, highlighted the ineffectiveness of the Duluth model, pointing to much better outcomes from other models, but models which were not numerous enough to provide an alternative. In Britain, those other models have been very carefully screened out by Respect, and everything accredited is essentially forced to deliver what Respect considers to be okay. The evidence against the effectiveness of the current accredited work is all there. Persisting with it is really colluding with creating an ongoing cycle of domestic violence. In whose best interest is that? Certainly not the children's, nor the males and the females involved. Obviously, from the Ministry of Justice point of view and CAFCAS, it is better to persist with something which you know doesn't work, as opposed to trying to find out something that might work. CAFCAS continues to spend your tax money and my tax money supporting programs which are demonstrably ineffective. 4 years have passed since that MOJ paper was published, recognizing that ineffectiveness. One wonders on what basis they persist in the face of this. Is this just another kids' company or another broken rainbow? Figures surrounding domestic violence. There is no doubt that women's overall experience of domestic violence is, on average, worse than men's. But when we take the child's perspective, dad's domestic violence is no more dangerous than mum's. The fact that dad's behaviours towards mum might be more serious is in part confounded by the fact that mums to dads will be much more chronic, and faced with the children, more often it is much more likely to involve the children than dads, which is why there is so much current interest by dads in the parental alienation agenda. Why would this be? Because mums spend much more time looking after children than dads in very many cases. Mums also kill more children than dads and stepdads combined. But what of the overall statistics? Much more than 20% Women's Aid's claim of domestic violence is by women. Before hearing of the Phoenix Project, as far as I knew, we were the only organisation delivering work in groups with female domestic abusers. Our figures for female abusers have dropped from between 10 and 15% of our clients in 2004 to about 2% now. This despite the fact that since our inception in 1995, female violence to men has reportedly increased by over 400%. And there is still very, very little money available to support male victims of domestic violence. So, just what is going on? The bit which is our responsibility, well, we don't have enough money to advertise directly for female abusers. When female abusers come into contact with the authorities, they are immediately sent on the Freedom Programme for victims of domestic violence. How insidious is that? If you want a good, accurate breakdown of the percentages of domestic violence abusers, this Canadian professor, Dr. Tonya Nichols, will give it to you straight. All the narrative talk in the media is about intimate terrorists, coercive controllers. Johnson's statistics illustrate 7 men per 1,000 being intimate terrorists prior to separation, and 5 women per 1,000 being intimate terrorists prior to separation. Post-separation, the figure for men escalates enormously to 22%, and the figure for women escalates greatly to 4.7%. It is recognised that often the most serious behaviours occur post-separation. The above figures would illustrate that. The most likely cause for the catastrophic change in those figures is exacerbated by the adversarial nature of the family court system, which encourages fighting and winning and losing, and additionally results in enormous losses, financial as we have heard, and in raising the emotions of grief, disgust and anger with all of the resultant situations in both males and females, but markedly much more so in males. Not surprisingly, children very often become the pawns in these often highly conflictual situations, which tend very strongly to be the cases we see. I believe that in the much wider picture, the vast majority of couples with children manage to accommodate the children's needs and rights to contact with both parents, usually reasonably amicably. The vast majority of domestic abuse concerns situational couple violence. Research by Professor John Archer, Louise Dixon and many, many others, you can read the extensive list in the ADVIT website, highlights that the main problem for the vast majority of people is going to be about coping with many of those situations in which people and couples find themselves. In the vast majority of cases, the research says it is women that start those situations with their discontent, justified and unjustified, about almost everything. That would imply a great deal of couple counselling, but not as far as the women's movement would have it. Women's Aid and Refuge will claim that couple counselling is dangerous for women, and effectively they nullified Relate's couple counselling contribution in about 2004. That also cost Relate about 50,000 of the 150,000 potential clients that they had per year. Relate's service would not have been available to most of the general population that needed because of the cost implications. Very many couples would simply not have been able to afford it, just as very many individuals are not able to afford the services which are required to begin to satisfy some of the rights of the children. Opportunities for learning together, as was so clearly stated by the woman of the couple in the film, is very likely to be the best way forward for the vast majority of people. Intervention, coming between and separating, is likely to raise much worse behaviours than already existed. there are other much more specific criticisms that need to be made. I'll make those at a later date. Early, individually focused, effective and collaborative work with abusers is essentially what is needed. And again, I'll explain this in much greater detail later. Just why are there no courses for female abusers? The answers are simple. The current nuanced agenda, the narrative, as opposed to the bigger picture, says all women are victims of the male patriarchy. For greater insight into this, you could watch the interview between Cathy Newman and Professor Jordan Peterson. If all women are victims, then all men are perpetrators. Notice the choice of words. Victim, perpetrator. Perpetrator, guilty of a crime upon accusation. If women were to be recognised as abusers, as some very clearly are, that would turn the simplicity of that narrative on its head. Prior to separation, 7 men per 1,000. Prior to separation, 5 women per 1,000. 7/12 versus 5/12. Can violent men change? Given the opportunity, I assert a high proportion can. They cannot do it with the Duluth program. The evidence is there. I repeat, they cannot do it with the Duluth program. The evidence is there. But that is exactly what Respect seeks to market, to accredit, and it seeks to impose. Respect will of course deny this, saying they are not wedded to one type of model. Their problem is they know nothing better, and for the last 18 years they have been determined to exclude anything which looked as if it might have any positive promise. When you put all your eggs in one basket and the basket doesn't hold, you are left with raw scrambled eggs. Those are the men that are failed by the programs which the accreditor seeks to impose. By failing to engage with the abusive men and abusive women and undertake meaningful work with them, the families are failed, and we, the country, have a basket case. And those violent women? In the current feminist narrative, they do not even exist. And the implications of that for child protection, for social services, for CAFCAS? Finally, I'd like to express our admiration of and gratitude to Katie Hindley and her team at Rogan Productions for the enormous effort and patience involved in filming probably at least 170 hours of our work and of attending 4 courses, one to take part so that she could experience the impact of the work on individuals and also gain insights into how it might be filmed and what some of the enormous issues are. Another course was used to practice filming, and 2 other courses were largely filmed. Her patience and dedication and sheer good humour and determination in the production of what we see as a well-balanced programme, albeit depicting the plight of a very small range of the many men she has seen who have been involved with us in this kind of work. That was our experience of the film production. There was then, of course, additionally, her involvement with all of the other contributors. You can find the vast majority of the text of this recording on our website, www.temper.me.uk, under the page marked Panorama. References I mentioned can be linked to from there. Thank you for listening and/or reading, and goodbye.